Hey, interpersonal communications class, how are we doing today? Today we're going to be covering chapter 5, listening. Okay, we're going to be talking about a lot of different things. We're going to be talking about the difference between hearing and listening first off. Okay, a lot of people will use the phrase hearing and listening almost interchangeably, but I want to give you a real basic thought when we use. First of all, let's do some definitions. Okay. Dictionary.com defines listening as giving attention with the ear, to pay attention, to heed, obey, to wait attentively for a sound, to listen for instance. Merriam-Webster says that listening is to pay attention to sound or listen to music, to hear something with thoughtful attention, to give consideration, to listen to a plea, to be alert to catch an expected sound. Okay, Oxford English Dictionary says to give one's attention to a sound, to take notice of an act on what someone says, to respond to advice, to listen for or listen out for, to make an effort to hear something. Also in North American, listen up as an imperative. Listen up, I've got to tell you something. Okay. What all of those definitions have in common is that listening is an active process, and that's what differentiates it from hearing. All of us can think of a time when we're having a conversation with someone or we're in a room with someone and we're talking, and we suddenly realize that they've tuned out and they've completely left the planet. They're no longer in a conversation with you. They're staring off into space. And what do we say? We don't say, "Can you hear me?" Okay, because clearly they're sitting a couple of feet away from you when you're talking. Clearly they can hear you. What you ask them is, "Are you listening to me?" Okay? And I want you to remember that basic difference between hearing and listening. So let's go into detail. So hearing, okay? Hearing is accidental. All right? Just because you're within range of the sound waves, you hear. Hearing is involuntary. Hearing is involuntary. Okay? Hearing takes no effort. Right? Now, listening is completely, well, not completely, physiologically it's the same, but it has very different qualities. Listening. Listening is focused. All right? Listening involves engagement. Okay? Listening has intent. Okay, now we've discussed in class before about how we physiologically make sound. Okay, our lungs and the muscles in our intercostal muscles in our ribs and our diaphragm compress our lungs, forcing air out through our larynx, which causes vibrations, which causes the compressions to move in waves. As that compression comes out our mouths, using our tongue, our teeth, our lips, our soft palate, and our hard palates, we modify those modulations and cause them to shape into air compressive waves. Those waves radiate from our mouths. They go over to our listeners. They are caught by the outer ear. They are funneled into the ear canal. They strike the tympanic membrane. They jiggle all those little things in your ear. Then that's translated into neural impulses that's taken to your brain. That's the physiological. And that happens all the time. That's hearing. Okay? We don't necessarily, we don't volunteer for hearing. We don't, right now, if I was quiet, you could hear, the noises in this room, and if you tuned into them, you could hear the clock on the back of the wall. You could hear the air handlers blowing. You could hear the fan from the computer over here humming. But you would have to tune, those are just what's called ambient noise. It's background noise. Okay? You have to put forth that is just Airwaves compress, striking our tympanic membranes. The airwaves are compressing and coming to us, so we hear that. When we start listening is when we become focused, we become engaged, and we intentionally seek out those sounds, okay? Everybody has an example of this, especially parents, okay? Parents are really good at shifting from hearing to listening incredibly fast. Parents in the room are going to be familiar with the idea that you would just be sitting there and all of a sudden you're in a crowded room. Oh, my camera's a little tilted here. Let me see if I can fix that real quick. Okay, is that better? That's a little bit better. Okay. Parents have been in crowded rooms where there's a lot of noise going on, but then you'll hear your kid cry in the midst of all that noise, and because that's a programmed memory in your head, you will shift from hearing to listening in a matter of a fraction of a second. And suddenly you go from something that's accidental, involuntary, and takes no effort to something that has intent, is focused, and engaged. Okay? So that's the difference between listening and hearing. Now we're going to talk about listening today and how that works. Because when you're in an interpersonal relationship and you're communicating interpersonally, you don't want to just be heard, you want to be listened to. Okay? So that's what we're going to talk about. Now there was a guy a couple of years ago named Blaine Goss. And I'm going to post this model, but we're going to talk about it for a few minutes first. This graph will be, because he does it better. So what Blaine Goss did, okay, he came up with a listening model that was fairly revolutionary that kind of blew everybody's mind. So you start out over here with auditory input. And you go in three sort of overlapping circles. Okay? And you progress through each one sequentially. So the first phase here is what's called signal processing. Signal processing. And what you do, well, let's spell signal right because that has an N in it. Signal. Okay? Signal processing, what you do here, you start to get segments of meaning. Okay? And you begin to pick up structures. And the best example I can use to talk about Blaine Goss's listening model is when you're, for anybody who's lived or traveled extensively outside the United States where you're not with a group of people who speak English or even speak American dialect English. So I've traveled in a lot of different places, and whenever you're in some place where there's a lot of talking going on, and people are talking in a foreign language, in my case it's been Arabic, German, French, Maltese, and even British dialect English, Scottish dialect English. Okay, you wind up beginning to hear out of the corner, just sort of out of the corner of your ear. You begin to pick up segments and structures that begin to tell you, hey, wait a minute, somebody in here is an American. I can't tell what they're saying, but the rate, rhythm, and the tone and the phonetics I'm picking up let me know that there's an American in here somewhere. Then you're just beginning to process the signal. Okay? When you apply more focus, you begin to get to literal processing. Okay? And with literal processing, you begin to pick up meaning and some simple implications. Okay? So now as you begin to tune in, you're not only, you're sitting in a German restaurant with a bunch of Germans. Not only do you begin to tune in on the fact through picking up these segments and structures, you're beginning to pick up meanings and simple implications. You begin to realize they're talking about the food. I don't know what schnitzel is. I don't know what brat is. I don't know any of this stuff. You begin to hear them think about and you're beginning to attach meanings to the sounds you're hearing. Then you get into reflective processing. Okay, reflective processing. And this is when you begin to do critical analysis You do critical analysis and you begin to appreciate what's being said, what you're hearing. Okay? So in that last phase, in that reflective processing phase, so you've heard these people, you begin to pick up the segments and structure through signal processing. You realize they're probably speaking English. Through literal processing, you're beginning to pick up some simple meanings and some simple implications. When you get to reflective processing, you begin to realize that they have no idea how to order food in a German restaurant. Okay? Same thing happens, okay? So that's with language. Same thing can happen with other listening, even if it's not language. You're driving down the road, you hear something in the background, you got your music turned up a little loud. You begin to feel, you begin to hear something that just is a little out of the ordinary. You're not sure what it is, but you're beginning to pick up some segments and some structures from some sound that's coming in from outside your car. You're not really sure what it is. Well, you begin to continue to listen and focus on it, and you begin your literal processing phase, and you begin to attach meaning and implications, and suddenly you begin to infer that that sound you hear is a siren. Okay? There's an emergency vehicle of some sort somewhere around you. So you begin reflective processing. You begin turning your head and using your two ears to sort of zoom in on where that sound is coming from. And you begin to start looking for a place that you could pull off to the side of the road in case the emergency vehicle is coming up from behind you. Okay? We go through these signal processing, literal processing, and reflective processing is a way to engage and to focus in a process. Now, what Blaine Goss did that sort of blew up the world was Blaine Goss came out and said, listening is just simply information processing. Okay? This is no different than any other information processing system. And it was a product of our knowledge of how computers work and about how information processing systems work and about how analytic machines work. And it literally blew up a lot of preconceived notions. Okay? Again, Blaine Goss is incredibly important. I will be posting his model. There's in the documents folder on the Blackboard page. But this is incredibly important in the way we now look at listening. So listening still has some basic components and some basic parts. So let's talk about the stages of listening. Now, I'm going to be giving you there's a couple of places I'm going to be using words that are slightly different. I will include what the textbook has, just so you see where it falls in. But the textbook doesn't usually what I would consider the most universally accepted terms for some of these stages. So I'll be using both. So the first stage of listening is receiving. Receiving. And receiving it happens in the ears. It's where we begin to isolate and manage what we're listening to. Okay? We begin to separate the message from the noise, even if the message is like a siren. Okay? A siren carries a message. There's an emergency vehicle. Please be cautious. Okay? So, and that is starts off as a physiological process. Okay? It then becomes, as we transition from hearing into listening, receiving is where we begin that process because we begin to focus and sort out the message from all the clutter. The next is understanding. Okay? And understanding is also often referred to as interpreting. 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 Now, in understanding and interpreting, we begin that act of interpreting and we begin to attach meaning to what we're hearing. We are now fully into, this is listening. Receiving starts off as a physiological process and begins our shift into an involuntary process, and it begins our shift into an intentional process. So with understanding and interpreting, we're attaching interpretations to the sounds, and we begin to attach meanings to the sounds. Then we have remembering. Or recalling. Now, this is something that's kind of new within listening theory. It used to be that people thought that how you interpret or how you think about things, and as you're listening, you react to things relatively instantaneously without a whole lot of thought. Okay? Well, what we now know is that even if it's something that we've heard a million times before, we still have to do that recollection of what that sound means. Okay? For instance, if I said the word mother, if that's a word you've never heard before, it's just a sound that I'm making, and it really doesn't give you any meaning. For us to listen and to add meaning, we have to recall when we've heard that word before, or when we've heard that sound before, or when we've had that experience before, so that we can apply it to what we're currently hearing. Okay? So memory and remembering and recalling is an integral part of listening and the attachment of our ideas, or our listening. Then we have evaluation. Now in evaluation, we get a little judgy. We begin to start taking in the sounds. We've begun to recall when we've heard that before. Okay? Now with a parent, like we talked about earlier, when I hear my child cry out in a large group of people, I receive it. I begin to understand and interpret it. I remember hearing that before, which means my child is hurt. And I begin to evaluate, when I recall other sounds like that, I begin to evaluate it and say, that means my child is hurt. That means my child is fussy. That means my child is being mean to some other child. Okay? We receive the siren. We interpret the siren. We remember when we've heard that sound before, and we evaluate it as being a siren. And then we have to, see the exact words, then we respond. Okay? So it's a 5-step process. All right? Receiving, understanding or interpreting, remembering and recalling, evaluation of the sounds, and then we respond to the sounds. Okay? But again, remembering. Remember, the one thing that a lot of people forget is memory. And remembering and recalling is an integral part of listening. Because even if you can't remember having heard that kind of sound before, that is remembering that you haven't heard it before. That involves your memory scanning through all your databases to see if this sound is familiar to me, so I know how to evaluate it. And if it's not something that you've heard before, you then know how you would evaluate it differently. Okay? So let's talk about types of listeners, or listening types. Now, I don't expect you to go around going, well, that guy's a discriminative listener. No, I don't really expect you to do that. But what I do, you need to be familiar with these things because you're engaging with people, okay? You're going to want to know that different people listen in different ways. And if you're having an ongoing relationship with someone in an interpersonal environment, you're going to want to maybe change your speaking styles or your communication styles to accommodate them. So the first one we want to talk about is discriminative listening. Discriminative listening. Okay? This is where it's mostly a physiological process. It's isolating specific sounds or looking for a visual clue that listening is taking place. All right? So if I'm having a conversation with someone, I'm engaged in discriminative listening. I'm looking to see some physical cue that they're listening to me. They may be making eye contact with me. I may say something provocative and I see them turn their head and look off into the distance, which shows they're taking it. I may see them physically orient their body toward me. Okay? This is physiologically identifying that someone is listening to you based on physical cues. There's informational listening. And that is exactly what it sounds like. That's when we're listening to comprehend and understand the information that's being provided to us. Okay? There is critical listening. Now, when we hear the word critical, we have a tendency to think that's negative, and it's not. Critical listening means that you're focusing on analysis. Excuse me. What that means is if we're involved in critical listening, we're listening to gain and synthesize new knowledge. We're not only taking the exact words they're saying, but we're analyzing it and putting it into knowledge structures that we already had, the schemata that we talked about earlier in class, and we're trying to look at the information and just do that next step analysis on it to get the most out of it. And then finally, there's empathetic listening. Empathetic listeners are trying to understand the experiences of the speaker. It's key in empathetic listening because you're trying to understand the experiences, the feelings, the thoughts, the emotions of the other speaker. Empathetic is the key to long-term relationships. And I'm not talking romantic relationships there. If you have a business relationship and someone's coming in and talking to you, if you can't empathetically listen to them and try to understand what they're telling you, trying to understand what their experiences are, then you're not going to have a very long-lasting relationship. That's part of the give and take of being in an interpersonal relationship. Okay? Now, there are 4 listening styles, or the way people will listen to you. Okay? The first is there are people-focused. People-focused listening. Now, people-focused listeners are mostly interested in what the speaker has to say. They're focused on the speaker. They don't care about the event. They don't necessarily care about what the speaker has to say. When we have people-focused speakers is when a celebrity comes to town to talk about some charitable cause. We don't care really that Kim Kardashian has come in to speak about justice reform in the United States. Kim Kardashian comes to town, place is going to be full. Why? Because it's Kim Kardashian. Because people want to see Kim Kardashian. Because she's a celebrity. Okay? People focused is, if Tom Brady came to Augusta to talk, people would go just to see Tom Brady. They're focused on the person that's speaking. Okay? They're focused on the speaker. All right? There's action focused. And these listeners are constantly looking at the motivations of the speaker. Okay, why are they doing this? What makes them want to say that? Why do they have that opinion? Why are they voicing this now? Okay, so there would be, it's called action focused, but really they're more focused on the speaker's motivation and what I can get out of listening to them. Okay, then there's content focused. Content focused. Content focused speakers or listeners are constantly analyzing the message to make sure that it makes sense or find out how they can engage with the message. Okay? They're not really that worried about who's saying it or why they're saying it. They're trying to figure out how they're trying to analyze the message and figure out its implications for them. And then the last one, and I find myself more and more falling into this 4th category, is time focused. Time focused. Time focused listeners just want you to get to the damn point. What have you got to say? Get in here, tell me, get it over with, let's move on. Okay? get to time-focused listeners, okay, just tell me what you need to tell me. So if we were going through each of these, people-focused is someone who says, wow, I want to hear what this person has to say because he seems really smart, okay? A action-focused person would be going, I wonder why he's saying that. The content-focused person would be going like, I hear what he's saying, and I'm trying to figure out how it applies to me. And then the time-focused person would be going like, okay, you've introduced yourself. Let's just get what you're here to talk about. Okay? I have a tendency on the phone to be time-focused when somebody calls me up and says, hey, Mr. McGinnis, I'm calling, asking you about what are you trying to sell me? I don't know you. What do you want to sell me? Okay? All right. So those are the 4 listening styles. Okay? Now let's talk about impediments to listening. Things that make listening difficult. Doesn't make hearing difficult, makes listening difficult. First thing that's an impediment. Noise. Now, there's multiple different kinds of noise. Noise, and we're not talking about noise like a truck going by outside, although that is certainly noise. We're not talking about an explosion, although that is certainly a kind of noise. Noise is anything that interferes with listening, okay? Is anything that interferes. There's physical noise. Physical noise is what I've talked about. Trucks going by. Something, as we talked about, as we speak, we compress air. Something that's compressing air harder than you are. A truck going by outside. A noisy neighbor. An airplane flying overhead. When you're trying to have a conversation with somebody at a concert and you're screaming your lungs out, okay? When you're on an airplane sitting in the back next to the engines, those are all physical noise, okay? There's psychological noise. Psychological noise just means that they're not ready psychologically or emotionally to listen to you, okay? We've all seen this in the movies. Yeah, baby, I was out late last night and I came home smelling liquor. But I want to tell you what happened. I really want to, I'm not listening to you. You've done this too many times before. I don't want to hear it, okay? That's psychological noise. Something that prevents you from hearing, and it's mentally. And that can also be something like, I'm getting sleep last night. And I just don't have the energy to focus on what you're telling me. Okay, so that's psychological noise. Next is physiological noise. Physiological noise is something within the listener's own body that's going to prevent them from listening. Okay? And it's very close to psychological noise, and a lot of times with physiological noise, like, your stomach may be rumbling. Now, that could have 2 impacts. Number 1, the noise of your stomach growling can cause you to go, and you stop listening to the speaker because your intent and your focus and your engagement is now on your lower intestinal tract. Okay? And so that's taking you away. So there's that physiological grumbling that's happening, but then there's that also psychological, all right, where's the nearest restaurant from here? Okay? That's all internal. Physiological noise is noise that happens within the listener's body. And then finally, there's semantic noise. And that's just a question of language. All right? If you're speaking in German, and I'm speaking English, or I'm speaking Japanese, and you're speaking Arabic, we have a problem with the semantic noise. Okay? The next thing that interferes will be differences. Okay, let me get rid of these so I can write bigger. So you have a hope of seeing it. Okay? Differences between thought and speaking rates. All right, so the average North American English speaker can talk at about 120 words per second, or per minute. That's about 2 words per second. The average person thinks, average English speaker thinks at a rate of about 400 words a minute. So if you look at that, 400 words per minute thoughts minus the 120 words that someone can speak leaves us with 280 words per minute left over. Okay? So what do we do with those 280 words a minute? Well, that's 2/3 almost, over 2/3 of our thought processes. All right, nearly 3/4 of our available mental capacity is ours to do with what we want. So someone's talking about something and we're listening very intently, and then he says something about, food supplies. And you go, oh yeah, food supplies. I got to go to Kroger after I get out of here. Yeah, I got to go to Kroger. And he's talking more about, fertilization. Got that. When I get to Kroger, I got to get me some Oreos. What? Yeah, corn. Yeah, I got to get a couple of cans of corn. Yeah, maybe I ought to get frozen corn. Frozen corn is supposed to be healthy. Frozen vegetables are supposed to be healthier for you. We haven't had spinach in a while, so maybe I'll get some spinach too. And pretty soon, you're making your shopping list, and you're no longer listening to your speaker who is discussing crop rotation. Okay? So that difference between thought and speaking rates can be an impediment to listening. Right? The next one is called selective attention. Selective attention. It happens all the time. Okay? You're sitting there having a conversation with somebody, and then some guy walks by you behind them with the biggest dog you've ever seen in your life. Thing weighs probably 280 pounds. And you don't want to interrupt them, but you just start going, what in the... And you just follow that dog as it walks into the distance. You've decided to shift your attention from the person you're engaging with to the dog that's walking by. And with this, in this interpersonal communication environment, you've shifted from listening to just hearing. Okay? And it happens all the time. You'll be sitting there having a conversation with somebody, and ESPN will be on. The South Carolina Clemson game will be playing. And you hear somebody, and it's going around the end. And you're sitting there going, And suddenly your full attention has been shifted to ESPN. You may not be looking over there, but you're certainly listening over there. And the person you're talking to, you're just hearing now. You've gone from hearing the TV set and listening to your partner to you're now listening to the TV set and hearing your partner. Okay? And then the last one is receiver biases. Receiver biases. Okay? If I started, and I was at a Southern College Leadership Conference a year ago, and I started talking to people about how I was a big Lady Gaga fan. I love Lady Gaga. And you could tell it was a room full of about 35 college students and me and one other instructor that were sponsors or faculty advisors there. And I just started talking about how much I liked Lady Gaga. And I threw out some examples. People completely and totally freaked out. Some people just got, after a couple of minutes, they're like, I could see them going like, what's this old dude talking about Lady Gaga for? He ain't got nothing that I'm going to want to hear. And so they just completely shut me out. Didn't want to listen to me anymore. Okay? That's receiver bias. They didn't think that I would have anything to say about Lady Gaga that was going to have any merit, so they just decided to ignore me. Okay? Now, there's also, within that receiver bias, which is we're going to call speaker bias, the person who's talking doesn't have anything you want to hear or isn't relevant. There's also a topic bias. Okay? Somebody comes up and goes, Hey, listen, I want to talk to you about gun control. I've heard it enough. Please don't come talk to me about that. Come on, let's move on. Let's talk about something else. Okay? You know, your partner, your spouse, your significant other comes in and says, hey, listen, I want to talk to you about, you know, what time you're coming to bed and how much you snore. Oh, come on. How many times do we have to talk about that? I snore. We know I snore. I don't want to hear it anymore. Okay? Or what's happening a lot now, and what I had happen in a conversation in my family, well, in a funeral about a year ago. I had, you know, someone say, somebody brought something up, and then I heard one of my cousins say, you know what, I think I've heard enough about racism. Let's just move on. Okay? That's a topic bias. They're never going to talk about that topic. They don't care. Okay? So now as a communicator, as someone who's engaged in communication, how do you make communication? How do you make people want to listen to you? Okay? A couple of things. First of all, use shorter sentences with active verbs. All right? Make it quick, make it punchy, give it an active verb. Don't say, you know, he was wanting to go to do it. He wanted to go. Okay? Short sentences, active verbs. Use personal pronouns. He, she, we, you, me, I, him. Okay? Don't talk about this generic you or they all the time. Use personal pronouns. Use simple organizations. Pro, con, problem, solution, cause, effect, chronological. Use narrative theory. Narrative theory says that we remember stories more than we remember facts. Okay, so if you've got something you want to tell somebody and you want them to remember it, tell it to them as a story. Don't say, hey, listen, we've invested so much money in it, blah, 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 blah. Okay, listen, let me tell you about one of our former customers, Bob. Bob came in here with $1,000. He put it in this kind of trust, and in 6 months, he had $3,000. He doubled his investment. Okay? Tell us a story. Form narrative theory. Use transitions. My first thing I want to talk to you about. The second thing I want to talk to you about. The third thing I want to talk to you about. Overall, the one thing you need to remember is simply this. You can't reread the spoken word. Now, I'm a big fan of William Faulkner, the Mississippi writer from the 30s and the 40s. His words, and he beautifully constructs these ideas and these sentences. But I'll be honest with you, sometimes, I mean, his sentences can run on for 2 pages, and he can have a single paragraph that can go on for like 3 pages. And I will sometimes be at the bottom of a page, and I will look at it, and I'm going like, what the hell is he talking about? And what do I do then? I go back to the beginning of that paragraph, and I start over. You can't do that with a conversation with someone. You have to keep everything in mind and remember everything is based on the premise that they're only going to get the chance to hear it from you that first time as it goes by. So you have to make sure that you keep them listening so that they're actively engaged and focused and intentional and not just hearing you. Okay? All right, so that's chapter 5. On listening. I will be posting the Blaine Goss model illustration in the documents folder on the Blackboard page, so it'll be there for you to look at. Blaine Goss is huge. You might expect to see Blaine Goss on the final. So be prepared to talk. Be prepared to remember all of that, and we will be in touch. Don't forget, discussion exercises are due on the Blackboard page by Thursday at noon. You'll get your grades back on Friday usually. I should be dropping another lecture in the next couple of days. All right, take care.